Well, I'm fortunate in that I got to do a whole bunch of liner notes and box set books for Bear Family Records. You know, this is a German record label that has done these enormous box sets and things. And I got the assignment to write a couple of box sets on Merle and a box set on Bonnie Owens. Now, if there's anybody out there who doesn't know who Bonnie Owens was, she's the woman from Bakersfield that was married to Buck Owens first and then Merle Haggard second. You know, pretty incredible lady. And she also was involved with Fuzzy Owen, who was Merle's manager. I knew that I had to talk to Merle. You know, it was like a really huge project. There was so much to talk about. And I was really brainstorming on how the heck I was gonna get in touch with Merle Haggard. Finally, there's this guy, and I don't think he's with us anymore. He was one of these sort of super fan rich guys that was at all the shows, you know? And I just get this text from him saying, here's Merle Haggard's phone number. He's probably gonna be cranky and he probably won't wanna talk to you, but there it is. I obsessed on this for probably 2 weeks. What the hell? How do I break the ice with Merle Haggard, who's going to be cranky that somebody's cold calling him on his cell phone, right? Well, first of all, you know, I called him and he's like, who are you? I said, look, I'm writing these box sets and I'm writing a box set on Bonnie. Merle thought the world of Bonnie. I think that's really the only reason that he didn't hang up on me that minute. But then I said, okay, the first question I got to ask you is, did you know that Lefty Frizzell was in the Roswell, New Mexico jail at the exact time of the Roswell UFO crash? And there was this long pause, and he goes, well, yes, I did. And somehow or another, I burrowed right into the deep corners of the country music conspiracy brain, you know, and I wound up interviewing him for about 10 hours on the phone, which was crazy. As I mentioned, I was writing about a huge bunch of recordings that he had made for Capitol and also this Bonnie stuff. And so I just kind of wanted to ask him everything I could think of regarding that project. And he gave great answers. You know, one of the things about Merle Haggard is that he was a really intelligent guy, not like a college educated sort of guy, but just gave very insightful answers. You could tell he was a really smart guy and always just got right. You know, if you asked him something, he didn't beat around the bush, man. He just went right for it. Like he just knew exactly what you were looking for, gave great quotes. But then I kind of ran out of stuff to ask him, right? But this was over the space of, I think, 3 days. I got 10 hours out of him, right? So when I called him this second day, then it started evolving into, he was telling me Grady Martin stories, you know, and I'm obsessed with Grady Martin. He's one of my favorite guitar players. And Merle worked with him for a time, I think in the 70s, it might have been in the early 80s, I can't remember. And so, man, he must have told me about an hour and a half of just crazy Grady Martin stories. And there's a lot, right? And then that sort of like petered out. And I was like, man, I've got Merle Haggard, and he's talking to me for hours and hours. What else? So then I just started asking him, like, okay, here's all of your number one hits. Just tell me the first thing that comes to mind. And strangely enough, even though that was kind of the very last thing that we talked about, it was really insightful, you know, like working man blues. He said, well, I needed my own Folsom Prison blues, and I needed it to be in the key of A. There you go. That's the story of work. I mean, what a great answer, right?
Yeah. Sometimes it's that simple.
Yeah.
Do you think by the third phone call, he had just loosened up with you so much that he was willing to just walk down the path with you?
Yeah. You know, the super strange thing is, and Merle was a weird guy. There's no doubt about that. I really felt like I had established a rapport with him, right? You can use this or not, but I do remember a funny story. So, you know, Merle and the Strangers were a super tight band. They played all the time. When they showed up to a Capitol recording session at the Capitol Tower, they would go in there well rehearsed. They knew these songs, and they'd record 3 or 4 hits in 4 hours, right? Just bam, 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 knock it out. Seasoned pros. Merle told me a funny story about Graham Parsons because Graham was really into Merle, right? And I love Graham Parsons. I know I'm going to offend somebody here, but you know, this is in the hippie era, and apparently Graham and his band would come in and they just kind of weren't prepared, and they were like sleeping in the studio, and they'd have a studio booked out for weeks at a time, and they weren't coming up with any hits. And Merle told me this great story about bringing Graham Parsons in to see one of their sessions, and it was like, yeah, we're all well rehearsed. They're like wearing dress clothes, you know, almost like they could go on stage. They sit down, they play the song, it's recorded, it's a hit. And he was telling me it just like blew their minds that you could just do that.
Yeah. Did Glenn Campbell play with Merle at any time?
Yeah. That session, I mean, I think there were a few sessions. I want to say it's 65, 66. It was pretty early on in his Capitol career where they did The Bottle Let Me Down. Glenn Campbell was playing on those, but he also sang backing vocals. And Merle was adamant. He said the blend of vocals that he got with Bonnie Owens and Glenn Campbell, he said, was the best vocal blend that he ever got in his entire career. And when you go and listen to those records that they cut at that session, he's right. I mean, it's phenomenal, that sound.
Huh. Was that Wrecking Crew stuff, or?
No, Merle was pretty lucky in that other than James Burton, he would bring in his band. But then James Burton played a lot of the leads on that stuff just because James Burton was playing lead guitar on every single California country record during that era.
Okay.
Roy Nichols is on a lot of those sessions, but just playing rhythm guitar. When the box set came out, I was driving up from Sacramento up to Portland, and you know, he lives outside of Redding. I called him on the phone. I said, hey, I have that box set. Could I swing by and just get you to autograph it and, you know, meet you in person? This is also a great story. He lived in a little town called Palo Cedro, if I'm remembering this correctly. And he had this enormous plot of land. And, you know, he told me, you know, go in this gate or whatever and look for the house. And so he drove through this thing for like a mile or two. I mean, it was a big piece of property. And finally I see this big house up on the hill, right? And so I pass by this smaller house and I go up to this big house on the hill. And when I get up there, like the glass is broken and there's weeds, and you can tell like nobody is living here. And so I call Merle again and he says, oh, no, it's the smaller house at the bottom of the hill. And apparently they had built this giant house and had mold issues or something with it or something like that. And so they just wound up living in this kind of standard 3-bedroom, 2-bath kind of house down at the bottom of the hill. But when I got there, you know, of course he's smoking weed on the couch out of a pipe. And he's like, so what part of Germany do you live in? I'm like, well, I just spent 10 hours on the phone with him. It's quite obvious that, you know, like, I'm not a German person, you know, and then I realized, oh, it's Bear Family Records from Germany. But what a cool guy, man. It was an amazing experience.
Yeah. How long were you there?
At the house?
Yeah.
Couple hours. I mean, he was super friendly. It was really his wife that kind of came around and was like sort of hustling me out at some point. But I think Merle, once he knew that you really loved old country music, you know, Maddox Brothers and Rose, all that kind of stuff, he just wanted to talk to you and hang out.
Yeah. Did he go pretty far down the rabbit hole when you guys talked?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And some other really great quotes that I remember, he talked about Roy Nichols, who was his guitar player for many years, but Roy Nichols started his career at the age of 16 playing with the Maddox Brothers and Rose. I want to say in the late 40s, early 1950s. And Merle said, when I was a kid, I heard about this boy that was so good on the guitar, he didn't have to go to school, nor work, nor nothing. And you could tell that was like the defining moment in his life. Like, wow, there's a guy that plays guitar so good. He doesn't have to go to school or have a job, you know? So it was all that kind of stuff. It was pretty fascinating.
You said that he told some Grady Martin anecdotes. Do you remember any of those?
Well, you know, for those of you who aren't familiar with Grady Martin was probably the most prolific session guitar player here in Nashville. You know, he started out at very young playing in a Western swing band here in town, here in Nashville. Then he started playing with Red Foley, who was sort of the #1 artist in the late 40s. Got a very high profile that way. He was on the Ozark Jubilee TV show that was broadcast out of Springfield, Missouri, with Red Foley hosting. And then Grady just kind of fell into this new studio musician system that they established here in Nashville. And he got in with Owen Bradley. And I mean, you cannot even list the number of records that Grady Martin played on. It's insane. When they were recording a bunch of rockabilly stuff in the mid-50s, Grady played all this insane rockabilly guitar. He's one of my absolute favorite rockabilly guitar players. And then he fell into just doing whatever needed to be done. You know, he played the nylon string lead on Marty Robbins' El Paso. He played the fuzzed out 6-string bass solo on Marty Robbins' Don't Worry. Just, you know, he played on all the Johnny Horton records, right? He's the lead guitar player on all the Johnny Horton records. The list just goes on and on. But it sounds like he was a real sort of a bear of a guy. I don't know how to describe it. He's just like a giant dude, for one thing. And I think, you know, I always have to tell this breakdown before I talk about guitar players always being really bad drinkers, right? My dad always used to say, always find a plaster guy, you know, to put up plaster, who's a drunk, because they're the good ones. You don't want a sober plaster guy, right? And he's right. I mean, you know, these guys have been doing it for like 40, 50 years. They get drunk, they throw up the plaster. It's perfect, right? And the old time guitar players were all that way. I mean, I haven't heard one story of an old time guitar player that wasn't a really bad drinker. But Grady was a drinker, you know, and so a lot of the stories that Merle told were just about, you know, Grady getting drunk and causing some sort of havoc. I remember some story he was telling me about being on a boat on Lake Shasta there in California with Grady, and Grady was drunk and somehow or another threw on the motor full throttle and the boat like went straight up in the air. And that's the only one that comes to mind. Well, you know, Grady had that reputation of being a guy that could make you a hit. You know, if you had Grady Martin on your record, it was going to be a hit record. So a lot of people like Merle just had ultimate respect for him.
Merle seemed to be pretty good at picking guitar players too.
Yeah, that's an understatement. I mean, he had some of the greatest, going back to Gene Moles from Bakersfield, who played on his early records, who was just a fabulous player. Had a guy named Phil Baugh play on Swingin' Doors, who was another insane player. And then Roy Nichols joined the band and played with him. There's a whole thing of, you know, James Burton actually was a session guitar player on a lot of those records, and there was a lot of confusion over who played what, but he just had this, I mean, it was insane, the guitar players he surrounded himself with.
And later Reggie Young.
Reggie Young and Grady Martin, you know.
Yeah. Are there places in Bakersfield that are like Merle Haggard sites that you have visited, or?
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, Bakersfield kind of reminds me of Memphis in a bit, because Memphis has all these places where amazing things happened, and yet there's just not anything happening there now, right? Nothing like that. And Bakersfield is the same way. I mean, Buck Owens was the #1 country music artist of the 1960s. Merle Haggard was the #1 country music artist of the 1970s. And there's just not really anything going on there now. You know, the Buck Owens Crystal Palace just announced that they're closing. It was kind of one of the last honky tonks in town, you know, and it's very sad. But yeah, I've been to a lot of the sites, and in terms of Merle Haggard, he was born in this railroad boxcar, kind of a famous story. And it was in Oildale, which is right over the river. It's the northern part of Bakersfield. Not really the bad part of town, but it's like the poor part of town, you know. And used to be able to just drive down this little street, and yeah, there's the boxcar that Merle Haggard was born in. Eventually, the Kern County Museum bought it and they installed it. They have a real nice thing behind the museum where they have these grounds you can walk on, and they put the boxcar that Merle Haggard was born in on the museum grounds. Well, the boxcar was the thing that he grew up in, and then once he started making money, you know, he bought a couple of really nice houses there. One of them was for sale not that long ago. You know, the house that he had in the late 60s, early 70s, where he was obsessed with trains. So he built like model trains that, you know, went all throughout the giant living room and stuff like that. But, you know, Bakersfield is one of those towns where people are either really poor or really rich, you know, and the agricultural guys, the oil guys, they made a lot of money. And then beyond that, it was Buck Owens and Merle were like the two country music guys that made a lot of money there. You know, the Telecaster thing, as far as West Coast music in Bakersfield is concerned, a lot of that really started in LA, right? You know, there was a rockabilly guy named Glenn, who was a friend of mine, and he always said the Bakersfield sound is actually the Los Angeles sound. It just doesn't have the same ring to it, right? But there was all these guys in the 50s, you know, guys like Wynn Stewart and Skeets McDonald, and Wynn Stewart in particular, I think was the guy that invented what we know as the Bakersfield sound. And, you know, Merle Haggard played bass for him, and Buck Owens covered a bunch of his songs. But he was really the guy that set up the archetype of what we call the Bakersfield sound. It's just that Bakersfield had a very healthy country music audience back then. And so all those LA artists, you know, like Joe and Rosalie Maphis, people like that, they would go up to Bakersfield all the time to play. And that's how the song Dim Lights, Thick Smoke was written, was after playing the Blackboard Cafe in Bakersfield. They were driving back over the Grapevine and wrote that song Yeah. So getting back to your question about the Fender Telecaster in Bakersfield music, Buck Owens was a session guitar player that played on a lot of records by a guy named Tommy Collins. And that was really kind of where the twangy treble pickup Telecaster thing came from. Roy Nichols was playing a Telecaster around the same time too, but he was a pretty sophisticated player and played a lot of Western swing, jazz type stuff. It was really Buck Owens playing this super brittle, very trebly kind of stuff. And in particular, those Tommy Collins records, there was a hit, I'm forgetting which one, that had this lick that was like, right? And so he would just kind of repeat that lick on all those records. But that's where it came from. And I would assume, you know, the stories are true. And I remember Merle talking about this, that the reason that they started playing the Telecaster was just because if you were in one of those really loud bar rooms, the treble pickup on a Telecaster was the only thing that would cut through. Yeah, and you know, the West Coast thing was different from out here. Out here, country music shows were more like a theater production where people would play on a stage and people would sit down in the audience and clap after each song and that sort of thing. And maybe they would do dancing, I don't know. But the West Coast thing, after World War II, you had all these hillbillies that moved out there from Oklahoma and Texas and Missouri and Arkansas and whatever. And they went to work in the defense plants and the agriculture industry. There was just all these jobs out there. And they were just a rowdy bunch. So the country music shows that happened on the West Coast happened in these really loud venues, you know, where people were just whooping and hollering and fighting and cussing. So the music had to adapt to fit that. I always like those stories of how technology progresses just based on a need, you know what I mean? And that's a classic case of it.
That's the best use of technology.
Exactly, yeah.
Solve a problem.
Yep. And just to throw that in, all those guys, all those Bakersfield guys, Buck and Merle and whatever, they all started playing on acoustic guitars and mandolins and banjos and things like that. They knew all that traditional music, but then there just came this time where it was like, no, now we have to play Telecasters through twins, and just be really loud and really trebly just so people can hear it. It's pretty interesting. Lefty Frizzell was such an influential guy, and in the early 1950s was a huge star, like on a par, maybe even greater than Hank Williams. People forget that today, but he had all these hits. He was, I think, the first guy that ever took planes to shows because his booking agent was keeping him so busy in the early 1950s that they'd book 2 or 3 shows a day, and he would have to like fly to all these different shows. It was nuts, right? And at one point, he ordered this customized Bigsby neck on his Gibson J200 guitar with a pick guard that said Lefty on it. And that was pretty much the height of hillbilly flash in the early 1950s. You couldn't get any better than having a Paul Bigsby customized instrument. And it's on a bunch of his record covers and stuff like that. And it's such an amazing looking thing. The guitar came up for sale, I want to say about 20 years ago. And it was at a guitar store in New York, and they were asking a bunch of money for it. And the really sad thing at that point is that nobody really knew who Lefty Frizzell was, It breaks my heart, but he just didn't have the name recognition that Hank Williams or Johnny Cash had. I remember when they were trying to sell it, I sent them a photo of Hank Williams Sr. playing Lefty's guitar, and they were like, oh, this is great. This will help us sell that guitar. I'm like, that's kind of tragic, man, But Merle Haggard was sort of the ultimate Lefty Frizzell fan. There's a great story of when Merle was a little kid. He went to go see Lefty play in Bakersfield, and Lefty let him hold his guitar and get up and play during the intermission. I think he was so small he had to stand on a chair or a box or something like that so he could reach the microphone. But just this very hugely influential moment in Merle Haggard's life. So eventually, the guitar store in New York City worked out a deal where they sold this guitar to Merle. And it was like, he set up a couple of different payments. It was a very expensive guitar. And that guitar went back to Merle, which is kind of amazing.
Did you have a chance to see that when you were at his house?
I got to see it when I was at the guitar store in New York City. And man, talk about a battle-scarred guitar. Lefty's story is pretty tragic, really. Another guy that was just a really bad alcoholic. And I would read stories about how Lefty would keep liquor bottles in his guitar case and carry the guitar without a case, right? So just seeing all the scratches and everything on the guitar, it's like, oh man, just imagine all the battles this thing went through.
There's a really sad chapter in George Jones' biography, his autobiography, where he talks about going and visiting Lefty there at the end of his life, and he was pretty much drinking himself to death. And, and a little bit of foreshadowing probably in George's mind of what could be his future. Yeah. But it was a pretty sad chapter. And then Lefty's buried here in Nashville, really close to String Bean, and I forget who else.
I think it's that same graveyard where, is it Hawkshaw Hawkins is buried there?
I think so.
And Jack Anglin of Johnny and Jack was killed on the way to the funeral.
Yes.
And so he's buried there too. Well, one thing you can say for certain, because I've been to all of them, every single cemetery here in Nashville has tons of country music stars. It's the first time that I went around to all of them, it was just mind-blowing.
When I got out of the car last night to go see you at Eastside Bowl, I looked across the street from the parking lot and was like, oh, Earl Scruggs over there, Jimmy Martin.
Hank Snow.
Yeah. Long list of, people over there. But anyhow, I am back to Merle.
Well, the one thing that I really appreciated about Merle Haggard is that he was really interested in history at a time when nobody else was. And he was such a hot star on Capitol Records that he could actually go to them in 1969 and say, I want to do a double album tribute to Jimmie Rodgers. I mean, that's insane, right? From a commercial standpoint, that's insane. And they were like, yeah, okay, you can do that. And then a few years later, he did a double album tribute to Bob Wills. You know what I mean? One of the things that I really, really respected about Merle was that he used his money and his fame to do really cool things at a time where most country music stars would just be looking to buy another car or more suits or whatever. He's like, you know, we can record a gospel album and we can record it down at the Nashville Mission in front of a bunch of, you know, homeless guys and bums. And I mean, who else would do that?
Yeah. He definitely seemed to avoid the where people would think of him as a nostalgia act.
Right.
So from one point of view, people might think of that, but I see him more as a person that was just kind of like, all right, I've reached a certain level. I'm going to do whatever the hell I want.
Yeah.
Made certain kind of records. He'd make a bluegrass record. Would tour baseball, minor league baseball fields with Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
Is that what a nostalgia act is supposed to be doing? It doesn't seem like that to me. And I kind of like that. Embracing people who might be jam band people or something to, yeah, we're a country band. We're going to do this thing. Come on out and enjoy it.
He was kind of a contrarian, and it must have been frustrating to be in his business circle, right? Because he was always sort of making these bizarre decisions, but at the same time, you know, he did some really cool things. Remember when he came out with the song Hillary, where he was promoting Hillary Clinton, and like all of his fans were like, right? He was just that sort of a guy, you know? He just decided one day, like, I'm going to write a country music song about why can't a woman be president, you know? And he just damn the consequences, you know? I like that about the guy.
There's probably moments in his career early on where he was hard-headed and said, no, we're going to do this, and it went well. Mm-hmm. And that probably, or you did something that maybe you didn't want to do and it went bad, and it probably ingrains, no, I need to do exactly what the hell I want to do.
Yeah.
I'm the one that faces the consequences of it, so I'm going to do what I want to do.
Yeah. And, you know, you can't discount the prison experience, you know? Just talking to him about that, you could tell that it just totally changed him, I think, for the rest of his life. And there's a Merle Haggard documentary where they interview Merle in his bunk in the back of his tour bus. And man, it's like the most profound quote where he's like, I'm still in a cell, you know? The only difference is that he just gets to choose what he wants to do, right? But the consequences of that is that he's still in this little 6x8 room every night, you know?
Did you ever witness any of his sound checks?
No, I never did. I was real good friends with Norman Hamlet, you know, who's still with us. And Norm told me when I was interviewing him for this box set, I said, Norm, you're the most continuously employed steel guitar player of all time. You started playing for Merle in 1967. You know, at that time it was like 2007 or something like that. It's the longest anybody's ever played with a single artist. He goes, well, Merle actually fired me 2 days ago. I'm like, what? You're kidding me. And then, of course, next week he was like back in the band. And I think this must have happened like 70 or 80 times, you know what I mean? So, yeah, I never witnessed any of the sound checks, but I get a feeling that it was always kind of like that.
I guess Red Volkert is another person we should have mentioned when we were talking about great guitar players that played with Merle.
Well, and Clint Strong, you know, the guy that replaced Roy Nichols, he was an amazing sort of Western swing player too. He just had one amazing guitar player after the other.
Yeah. So when did the box set come out?
Came out 2008, something like that. They sort of chronicled the second half of his Capitol Records career up until about 1976. And the Bonnie Owens thing was everything that she ever did. You know, it was one of those super comprehensive Bear Family box sets.
They do pretty amazing stuff. It's if you're like a completist and you're way down the rabbit hole, you would probably love the Bear Family stuff. I met, I don't remember the name of the man who owns Bear Family Records.
Well, you're probably thinking of Richard Weitze.
Okay.
And he sold the company a few years ago, and he's basically retired now. But Richard is the maniacal guy who just went in all these tape vaults and, you know, found all this amazing unreleased stuff and insisted, okay, and, you know, like Hank Snow was Richard's favorite artist. I think they did 16 Hank Snow box sets, right? It's like 5 or 6 CDs each. That's a lot of freaking Hank Snow. But it was important to him, you know?
It's beautiful somebody's doing that.
Yeah.
And he's got skin in the game. He's a, you know, dude, I met him in Knoxville, really quick thing. And I said, okay, here's everybody you meet pitches you something. Here's what I'm going to pitch. And he's just kind of like, oh God, here we go. And I said, well, in Memphis in the 60s, the wrestlers started making 45s of them singing something, and the players were, you know, like the great Memphis session players who played on all the great hits coming out of there. And so that's the backing band on these wrestlers. Make a box set of this
Sputnik
stuff.
Monroe and guys like
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Jerry Lawler stuff. But there's, and if you can't get enough stuff from Memphis, you know, they were the first ones to do it, but go across the U.S.
Yeah.
It's spread. Make a box set of that. The wrestling fans are rabid. They buy all kinds of stuff. And he paused for a second. He's like, well, I give you credit for that being like actually an original idea, but I'm not going to do it. And
Yeah.
walked off. And,
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, he was real funny about certain things. I actually pitched him an Arthur Alexander box set because nobody's really done a proper, comprehensive Arthur Alexander box set. And he's the only guy that was covered by both the Beatles and the Stones and Bob Dylan. I mean, he's an important guy, but yeah, Richard was just like, no one will buy this. And that was it, you know.
Well, how did you hear about Merle Haggard passing away?
Well, you know, I saw him play in Los Angeles. It must have been one of his very last shows. And he was great. I mean, he still put on a really great show. And then it was a couple months later, it was just like, yeah, he's gone.
If you're going to go listen to Merle today, like what's your go-to stuff?
That's a very good question because when I did this box set, I didn't realize just how good that later Capitol stuff is, you know, from the late 60s through about 1976. It's insane how good of a songwriter that guy was during that era. He just one after the other. It's all great. So I would say on some days I might want to listen to the 1965 to 1967 stuff, all the early hits. But then on other days, man, I just want to listen to all that 70s stuff just because the songwriting is so good.
Yeah.
And even though it's not my go-to stuff, the guy hardly ever made a bad record. I mean, all the 80s stuff, the 90s stuff, it's all really good.
There's so much of it that I hear stuff quite often that I don't remember hearing before that I'm like, why do I not know about this? This is really good.
Yeah. The only, you know, I'm not a fan of 80s or 90s production very much, you know, all the gated snares and that kind of stuff. But man, there's no denying that he was singing great and writing great songs all through that era.
Yeah.
When I did these box sets on Merle, the best interview other than Merle was Norman Hamlet, his steel guitar player, because Norm was sober the entire time. You know, all this wild stuff was going on and Norm was dead sober, driving the bus in addition to playing steel guitar. And Norm told me that when he was a kid growing up in the Central Valley in California, he was from Visalia, a little north of Bakersfield, they actually offered a country music class in high school because country music was considered a real vocation then, right? It was just like learning how to work on cars or something. Like you can make money playing country music, which is wild to think about. Yeah. And he said that Jean Shepherd was in his class because she was also from Visalia. So that's sort of where Merle and all those guys came from, was this is a vocation that you can make money doing. which is weird for us because guys like you and me, you're not going to make any money doing it. You're just doing it because you love it and because it's great music. But back then, it was an industry.
I was greatly discouraged.
Yeah.
By everybody around me, by the city, by,
Right.
It's just not the sort of thing in the Midwest that anybody thinks, what are you doing that for?
Yeah.
When are you going to go to the factory?
My parents were very supportive of me playing music as a creative outlet.
Yeah.
The minute that I decided to make it my vocation, they were horrified. It was like, no, you're not supposed to do that. Don't do that.
Yeah.
And, here I am all these years later. Here we are.
When you were growing up in Missouri, did you ever see Merle at a young age?
I did. I wish I had a better memory of it, but I was really young. I think I was 18 or 19. There was a show at the Hearns Center, which was like the big sort of echoey sports place where they also had concert. It was George Jones, Conway Twitty, and Merle Haggard. And man, I wish I could go back there with my current brain and just absorb every single second, because I was just dumb and I was just like, there's Conway Twitty, there's George Jones or whatever, I think we snuck in, we knew a way to like sneak in through the back entrance. But what a lineup. Can you imagine that?
Oh, yeah. Wow. What year would that have been?
I was driving, so maybe 1985, 1986, something like that.